In this tutorial, I will show you how to create this procedural chocolate bar material in Blender. And as you can see, the modeling is going to be very simple. So we're just going to be adding this cube here and we're going to be shaping it to the shape of the chocolate bar. And then we're also going to be subdividing the mesh, and that way it'll have more geometry for the displacements to work. And then the displacements are going to be creating the shape of the top of the chocolate bar. So here is the procedural material, and after we create the procedural material, I'm going to show you how to join it together into this custom node group with all of these different sliders. So we have the scale to change the entire size of the material. Then we also have the bar pieces X scale to make that smaller or bigger, and also the bar pieces Y scale. So if your chocolate bar is a different size, you can change that. Then we also have the bar gradient, and the bar gradient is going to change the size of that gradient right down there. Then we also have the base color, so if you want to make this a different chocolate color, you can. And then we also have the subsurface color. Then we also have the subsurface amount, so I can turn this up if I want to allow more light to go through the chocolate. And then we also have the roughness to make the chocolate more rough or more shiny. And then we also have the bump strength to make the chocolate more bumpy. And then we also have the displacement strength, so if you want to make the chocolate bar popping out more, you can. And then finally, we have the bar pieces location. So depending on what model you add this to, you might want to move the bar pieces location around, and you also might want to change the X scale and Y scale. If you'd like to help support me and this channel and purchase the material, then you can get that on my Gumroad store, and you can also get this material if you join my Patreon page. And if you'd like to purchase all of my procedural materials, then definitely check out my Ultimate Procedural Material Pack. And in my Ultimate Procedural Material Pack, you'll get all of my procedural materials pre-set up in Blender's asset browser with custom thumbnails, sorted catalogs, and customizable node groups. And you can also check out my procedural material packs if you'd like to purchase packs of 10 materials. And if you'd like to learn how to create all of my procedural materials, then definitely check out my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist with the link in the description. So real quick, I'm going to show you what I have set up in the 3D viewport if you want to set it up the same way that I have. So I pressed Shift A, I went here to Mesh, and I added a cube. And then the default primitive objects in Blender are a little bit higher than an average human when modeling to the real life scale in Blender. So I'm going to scale this cube by 0.1 and then hit enter. And that is going to be much closer to a chocolate bar size. Then I'm going to scale this object again, and this time I'll scale it on the Y-axis, and I'm going to scale it by 6 and then hit enter. And then I also want to scale out again on the X-axis, so I'll scale it, and then I will hit X to scale it on the X-axis, and I'm going to type in 3 and then enter. And then I want to flatten it down so it's not quite as thick, so I will scale it on the Z-axis, and I will type in 0.5 and enter. And that way it is a better shape for a chocolate bar. Then I can just press Ctrl A, and I'm going to apply the scale, so this is now the object's new default size. Now I want to add more geometry so that the displacements have more geometry to work with. Because right now if I go into edit mode, you can see there's very little geometry, and so the displacements wouldn't look very high quality. So what I'm going to do is go here to the side, the long end, and I'm going to press Ctrl R to add a loop cut, and then I'm going to type in 100. So 100, and then I can left click and right click so they stay in the center. Then I can go here to this edge, and I'll press Ctrl R to add another loop cut, and this time I'm going to type in 50, and then I can left click and right click so it stays in the center. And let's go here on the side, and I'm going to press Ctrl R to add a loop cut, and this time I will type in 10, and then I can left click and right click. So now this object has lots of geometry, and so the displacements will have more geometry to work with. Now I do want this to have even more geometry, so what I'm going to do with this object selected in object mode is I'm going to click on add modifier, and I'm going to add the subdivision surface modifier, and this will give it even more geometry. Now if it's getting too laggy for your computer, you can turn the levels viewport down to just like 1 or even 0 so that the viewport has less geometry, but then it will actually render with 2. But my computer can handle it, so on the levels viewport as well as render, I'm going to turn these both up to 2 so that it is subdivided and it has even more geometry. And then using the object context menu, I can shade the object smooth. And then I also just added a camera, and I pointed the camera at the chocolate bar. And also if you select the camera and go over here to the object data properties, I turn the focal length of the camera up to 70 just to kind of zoom it in a little bit because I do like that a bit better. Now for the lighting, I added these 2 area lights. So this first area light right here, I turned the shape to rectangle, and I just kind of scale it up and put it here on the side, and I set the power to 400, and I also gave it a very slight yellow color. And And this other one here, this is pretty similar. It is a rectangular shape and it's kind of pointed down on the chocolate bar. And this one, the power is 5000, and then the color is again a slight yellow color, just to give some nice lighting on the chocolate bar. And then also to get even more realistic lighting and reflections, if you go over here to the world properties, I added in this Kaylee interior, and this is a free HDRI from polyhaven.com. Link will be in the description if you'd like to download it. And I downloaded the 1K HDR version. So once you download the HDRI, you can click here on the yellow dot next to color, and you can choose environment texture. Then you can just click on the open button and you can open up the downloaded HDRI. Now if you want to make the background transparent so you can't see it, then you can click right over here to the render properties and you can open up the film tab and then just check mark the transparent button. And then also to make the colors look a bit nicer, if you go down here to the color management, I'm just going to open this up. I'm going to make sure the view transform is filmic, and then I will set the look to high contrast. And so this will make everything a bit more contrasty and it'll make the colors a bit more saturated. Now because I'm using displacements, I do need to use the cycles rendering engine because the Eevee rendering engine doesn't support material displacements. So just make sure that you are using cycles. So I am in the shading workspace, so I have the 3D viewport right over here, and I am in the rendered mode, and then I have the shader editor right over here. So let's click on new to add a new material, and I can rename the material. And then in order for the material to use the displacements, we need to click right over here to the material properties, and I'm going to open up the settings and then go to surface, and right here on displacement, we want to set this to displacement and bump. And this is telling the material that it can use the displacements. And then I'm also going to be using the Node Wrangler add-on to preview the different nodes. So if you don't have the Node Wrangler enabled, you can just click on edit and go to the preferences, and then over there on the add-ons tab, just search for Node Wrangler and you can checkmark the Node Wrangler add-on. And I'll show you how to use it in the video. So the first thing that we want to create is all of those little chocolate pieces. So to do that, I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go to the search, and I can search for the Voronoi texture. Let's stick this down here. And then using the feature of the Node Wrangler, you can Control Shift and then select the Voronoi texture. That is going to preview the node on the object. Now right now it's just some little dots, and so I want to change that. So I'm going to click on this F1 here, and I'm going to change this instead to the distance to edge. And so this way we're going to have some little white areas with some little black lines. Now it is very random right now, and I want it to look more uniform, to look more like chocolate. So I'm going to take this randomness value here, and I'm going to turn this down to 0. And this way it is going to be nice and straight. Now you can see that it's kind of stretched in some areas, like right down here it is really stretched, and so I want to use the object coordinates. So with the Voronoi texture selected, I can press Ctrl T, and that is going to add the texture coordinate and mapping nodes. Now I want to use the object coordinates, so let's just put the object into the vector of the mapping, and so this way it is going to place the texture on the object more evenly. And then we can use the mapping node if we want to change the location, rotation, and scale of the texture. Now I actually want to leave this mapping node how it is, add all of its default values, because later on when we join this into a custom node group, I'm going to want to use the scale values to change the size of the entire material. But I do want to change the size of the Voronoi texture. So I'm going to select this mapping, and I will press Shift D to duplicate it, and let's stick it here after the first one. So now we have another mapping node, and we can use this mapping to change the size of the chocolate bar pieces. So let's now change the scale of the mapping. So right here on the X, I'm going to drag this out a bit because I do want to scale it down. Basically, I want to have 5 pieces going back and forth and then 3 pieces going this way. And specifically, I'm going to use a scale value of 1.29. And then here on this Y value, let's also drag this, and I'm going to make this a bit smaller. And specifically, I'm going to use a value of 0.81. Now I also want to change the location because you can see that it's kind of overlapping. There's kind of like half a bar right here. So on this location, I just want to drag this over, and specifically, I'm going to use a value of 0.1 on the location X. So now you can see we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 this way, and then actually we have 4 this way. That's what I wanted. I wanted to have 4 this way and then 5 going up and down. So we can now put this Voronoi texture into the displacement to give it some bump, because basically when we put it into the displacement, whatever values are lighter, that's going to make it popping up, and where the values are darker, that's going to make it going back down. And so the little pieces of the chocolate bar will be popping up. So let's take the distance here from the Voronoi, and I'm going to put that into the displacement. Now when I do that, you can see there's some weird issues here, and that's because we need to convert this black and white data into displacement data. So I'll press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for the displacement node, and we want to put the displacement here in this wire. And I can just drag it down here underneath the principled shader. And then to properly convert it to displacement data, I want to take the distance and I want to put that into the height value. So now it is actual displacement data. Now it is still looking really weird, and that's because we need to turn the scale way down. So let's just turn the scale way down to a very small number. And specifically, I'm going to use a scale value of 0.02. So just 0.02, so it is very subtle. And if the displacements are still not working, then as I mentioned at the starting of this video, you need to make sure that you're using the cycles rendering engine. And also right over here on the material properties, if you go here to settings, you need to make sure that the displacement is set to displacement and bump. And then again, we want the Voronoi to be going into the height value of the displacement. And then the displacement node can be going into the material output. Now this is very, very subtle, and that is because these values are very gray. And so I want to make it more contrasty and make the values lighter so that they're popping up more. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I can search for the color ramp, and let's put the color ramp after the Voronoi. And I can Control Shift and select the color ramp to preview it. So I want to make the pieces of the chocolate lighter. And so to do that, I can take this white tab on the color ramp and I can drag this out. And you can see as I drag it out, it gets lighter and lighter because it's more contrasty. And so now you can see those pieces of chocolate are popping out. So I'm just going to bring the white tab to about here, and I'll leave the black tab where it is. So I can now Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview it. Now it is very white, so let's make the base color. So I'm going to click here on the base color, and let's make this a very, very dark color, and then I'm going to make it kind of a reddish brownish color to look like dark chocolate. And if you want to use the exact same color that I'm using on the base color, then you can go to the hex value, and you can punch in a hex value of 100, 400. So 100400. And then while we're here, we might as well do some of the other settings of the principled shader. So I also want to turn the subsurface up a little bit, and the subsurface scattering will allow just a little bit of light to go through the material. So I want this to be a very small number, so I'm going to turn it to a 0.008. Just a very small number, but now if you zoom in there, you can definitely see there's just a little bit of light going through the chocolate. Now also we have this subsurface color here, and I don't want this to be white, so I'm going to click on this, and I'm going to make it kind of a red color, and then I'm going to make it very dark. And if you want to use the exact same color that I'm using for the subsurface color, you can go to the hex value and you can punch in 2B 0100. And then I also want to make this chocolate a bit more shiny, so let's turn the roughness value to like a 0.3 just so it's a bit more shiny. And then also back on this subsurface here, I want to click on this subsurface radius, and I believe the default subsurface radius has been made to work well when you're creating skin. And so we have these three values here if you click on the subsurface radius, and the top one is red, and then the next one is green, and then the last one is blue. Now I want to have an even amount of red, green, and blue subsurface scattering values. So I'm going to click and then drag down, and then I'm just going to type in 1 and then enter. This way there's going to be even amounts of red, green, and blue subsurface values. Alright, so we can now go back here and continue with the displacements. So I'm just going to box select all these nodes and bring them out so there's a bit more space. Now there is a big problem with this chocolate bar, and that is that the edges are super sharp, and I want them to be more smooth. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for the RGB curves, and let's put the RGB curves after the color ramp. So I can now click here in the center to add a dot, and I can drag this up, and you can see as I drag it up, it's actually changing the shape of the displacement. So I'm going to drag this white dot over here kind of into this value, and actually I want a bit more space, so I'm going to box select these and kind of drag them out, and then I can actually click on the edge of the RGB curves and kind of drag it out so it's a bit thicker. So I want to put this first tab right about here, and you can see already that is rounding out the edges, and that looks much nicer. And then here, if you click on this tab at the end, I want to drag this down a bit, and I also might drag this one down a little bit. And if I drag this down, it's going to make the top so it's not quite as sharp. So I'm just going to drag it down a little bit so it's a bit more flat on the top. And you can continue to play around with this if you want to. You could like drag this down, but you can see if I do that, it's kind of making kind of a weird shape there on the edge. So I'm actually going to delete that just by clicking on this dot here and hitting the X button. So I'm just going to have these three dots. So this one down here, then this one up here, and then this one over here. And so already that is looking much more like the shape of a chocolate bar. Now there is another problem, and that is that the chocolate bar pieces go all the way through and go underneath the chocolate bar. But chocolate bars only have the pattern on the top, and on the bottom it is usually smooth. So what I want to do is create a gradient, and we are going to make the gradient go up and down, and then we are going to mix that gradient with the texture. So to do this, I'll press Shift A. Let's go to the search, and I can search for the gradient texture, and let's stick it here above the Voronoi. And then I want this mapping node to control the entire scale of the material, so let's take the vector of this first mapping, and we can put that into the vector of the gradient. And then I can Control Shift and select the gradient texture to preview it. So you can see it starts out as black, and then it gets lighter and lighter. Now the problem with this is that it's going back and forth, and I instead want it to be going up and down. So we can just use another mapping node, and we can rotate the gradient over. So let's click on this mapping node, and I can press Shift D to duplicate it, and let's just drop it right here. So then this mapping is going into the gradient, so then we can use the mapping rotation to rotate the gradient around. So right here on the Y value, I just need to type in 90. So on the Y rotation, just type in 90, and now you can see it starts out as black, and then as it goes up, it gets lighter. Now I also want to make this gradient much more contrasty because you can see it is very gray. So I'm actually going to click on this color ramp, and I can press Shift D to duplicate, and I'm just going to drop it right here. So I now actually want to flip these values. So I'm going to drag the black tab over here, and then I can drag the white tab over here. And so I want to make the gradient very contrasty and sharp. So I'm going to drag the black tab and the white tab very close to each other. Now when I do that, you can see the entire thing is white. And so I just need to bring the gradient up so we can see the edge better. So right back here on the mapping, we can take the X location and we can turn this up. And you can see once I turn it up far enough, it's going to come down. So let's just turn that up to about there. And specifically, I'm going to use a value of 0.36. So 0.36. So now you can see there's black up here and then white down here. So we can now mix this gradient texture with the other displacement texture. So to do this, I'm first going to box select these nodes and bring them back so I have a bit more space right here. Then I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for the mix node. Let's drop the mix down here, and then we're working with color values. So I want to click on the float, and I want to change that to color instead. And then I can take this first color here from this color ramp, and I want to put it into value B, and then this RGB curves, this is going to go into value A. And then to preview it, let's Control Shift and select the mix to preview it. Now I just want to add the light values. So let's click on the mix here, and I can change this to a lighten instead. So now if I turn the factor to 0, it's just using the RGB curves, but then if I turn the factor up, it's going to add the light values of the color ramp. And if I Control Shift and select the color ramp, you can see the color ramp is light down here, and then it is black up here. So if I Control Shift and select the lighten, you can see it's just adding those white values down there. And so now we just need to make this affect the displacement. So I can take the lighten result here, and I can replace it here in the height value of the displacement. And so now that I've done that, you can see that the chocolate bar pieces isn't on the bottom, it's only on the top. So I can Control Shift and select the principled shader, and that is looking really great. So we are almost done with this chocolate bar material, but I do just want to add a little bit of noise in the normal to give it some bump. But chocolate is usually pretty smooth, so I do want it to be very subtle. So let's press Shift A. I'm going to go to the search, and I'm going to search for a noise texture, and let's put the noise texture above this mapping. And then again, I want this mapping here to control the entire scale of the material. So let's take the vector, and I can put that into the vector of the noise texture. And then I can Control Shift and select the noise texture to preview it. So let's now change some of the noise texture settings. So I'll just turn the scale to like 30, and then I also want it to be very detailed, so let's turn the detail up to the max of 15, and I also want to turn the roughness up so it has a bit more roughness, and that way it'll have a bit more detail. So I'll turn the roughness to a 0.55. So I now want to put this noise texture into the normal to give it some bump. So we can take the factor of the noise texture, let's drag a wire over here, and I want to put it into the normal. And then I can Control Shift and select the principled shader. Now you can see there's some weird shading issues, and that's because we need to convert this black and white data into normal data that the shader can actually use. So let's press Shift A, I'm going to go to the search, and I can search for the bump node, and we want to put the bump node in this wire here before it goes into the normal. And then we actually want the factor to be going into the height value of the bump, and that way it'll convert it to normal data. So now the chocolate actually has some bump, but it is way too strong. So let's turn the strength way down so it is much more subtle, because I want just a tiny little bit of bump over the surface. And specifically, I'm going to use a strength value of 0.015. And then I also want to add one more texture just to give it a tiny little bit of bump. So right back up here above the noise texture, I can press Shift A. Let's go to the search, and I can search for the Musgrave texture. Let's put the Musgrave up here, and then I can take the vector and let's put that into the vector, the Musgrave texture. And that way it's connected up to this mapping, and it's also using the object coordinates. And then I can Control Shift and select the Musgrave texture to preview it. So let's now change some of the settings. So right here on the scale, I want to turn this way up so there's basically a bunch of little dots. So I'm going to turn the scale up to 500, and then I want to leave all the other settings at the default. So we can now just put this Musgrave texture into the normal to give it some bump. So what I can do is select this bump node, and then I can press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'm just going to drop it right here after the first one. Now the normal can go through the normal of the bump nodes, but we now have this extra height value that we can add data into. So let's take the height from the Musgrave texture. I'm going to bring out a wire, and I will drag this over here, and I want to stick it into the height of the bump node. And then I will leave the strength at a 0.015 so that it is very subtle. So I can now Control Shift and select the principled shader, and you can see now the chocolate just has a very subtle bump. And so there we go, that is the finished procedural chocolate bar material, and that is looking quite tasty. So let's now join this material together into a custom node group. So I'm going to click and drag just to box select all the nodes, but I'm not going to box select the material output. So just click and drag to box select all the nodes except the material output. I can then press Ctrl G, and Ctrl G is going to join it together into a custom node group. So if I press the N key, that'll open up the side panel, and you can click here on group, and you can see there are inputs and outputs. So here on the outputs, I want to click on this BSDF. I'm going to double click on it to rename it, and I'm just going to rename it to shader. And then I can click on this up arrow just to bring it up because I want it to be on top. And then I can press the tab key to go out of the node group. And I just want to drag the node group over here so that it is closer to the material output, and I can also drag it out to make it a bit bigger. And then I also want to make it the same name as the material, so I can click on the chocolate bar name, and I can press Ctrl C to copy. I can click on the node group and press Ctrl V to paste that. So now it is called chocolate bar. So I'll hit the tab key to go into the node group. So the first value that I want to create is the overall scale of the entire material. And this mapping node here, this scale is going to control the entire scale of the material because the mapping node is going into all of the textures. So we can take the scale here from the mapping and let's put that into the group input. And then right here you can see this is already renamed to scale. Now I just want this to be one single value. So if I click on the type here after clicking on the scale, I can change this to float, and this way it'll use one single value. And then I just need a tab to go out of the node group, and on the scale here I can just turn this to 1 because that's the default scale. So let's tab to go back into the node group. So the next values that I want to add is the scale of the chocolate bar pieces, because if you're adding this onto another object, you might want to change the scale. And so right down here in this mapping, you can see we have this scale value here, and I can change this, and that's going to change the size of those pieces. Now I could just plug the scale value up here to the group input, but I actually don't really want the Z value. I just don't need it. So what I'm going to do here instead is press Shift A. I'm going to go to the search, and I'm going to search for the combine XYZ. So I'm going to click on the combine XYZ, and I'm going to drop it here. And then before I plug this vector into the scale of the mapping, I just need to copy over the values. So you can see there's this value here of 1.29. So right here on the combine XYZ, I want to change this to 1.29. And then right here on the Y, I need to change this to a 0.81. So that is the same number. So I can now take the combine XYZ, and I can stick that into the scale, and so basically it's taking those same values and it's basically copying them over to here, but it's now broken these up into 3 different values. So now what I want to do is just bring this down here, and I can take the X, let's put that here into the group input, and also the Y, I can put that into the group input. And so now you can see they're right up here, so I can double click on these to rename these. So you can rename these to whatever you want, but I'm going to rename this one here bar pieces X scale, and then this one here I'm going to rename to bar pieces Y scale. Now I also want to add a value to change the height of that gradient right there, because this gradient texture is controlling where the pieces end. And so that is going to be controlled by this mapping behind the gradient. So we have this location value, and that'll bring the gradient up and down. So I want to do basically the same thing that I did with this combine XYZ. So I'm going to click on the combine XYZ. I will press Shift D to duplicate it, and I can drop it up here. And then I can hit the backspace with it selected, and that is going to reset the node. And then you can see there's this location X, and that is a value of 0.36. So right here on this one, I want to change this to the same number. So a 0.36. Then I can take this mapping location. This is the one behind the gradient, and I'm going to put that into the vector. So it's basically going to split up the values into 3 values, and then I can just take the X one, and I'm going to put that here into the group input. And then I can rename this. So I'm going to rename this to bar gradient. So let's now add the base colors. So I'm going to click on the group input, and I'm just going to drag this up here, and I'm going to drag it over to the principled shader. And let's take the base color, I can put that in there. And then also the subsurface color, I can stick that in there as well. And then I also want to be able to control the subsurface. So let's take the subsurface, and I can put that in there as well. And I don't need to name these because they're all named correctly. And then I also want to control the roughness. So let's take the roughness, and I can put that in there as well. And then I also want to control the bump strength, so I'm just going to bring this down here, and I can take both values of the strengths here on the bump, and I can put that into the extra socket here, and I can take the same one here, so this strength, and I can put that into this socket. And because we're putting them both into the same socket, this single value will control both bumps. And I can double click on this to rename it, and I'm going to rename it to bump strength. And then I also want to add the displacement strength. So let's take the scale here from the displacement, and I can put that right there. And then I can click on this to rename this, and I'm going to rename this to displacement strength. And then I'm going to take this group input, and I'm going to drag it right back way down here. And the last value that I want to add is the location of these bar pieces. So if you go here to the Voronoi texture, right behind the Voronoi, we have this mapping, and we have these location values. So I'm just going to take the location, and I'm going to stick that here into the bottom group input. And then I can double click on this to rename it. And I'm going to rename it to bar pieces location. So I can now tab to go out of the node group. I'll press the N key to close the side panel, and we can now review the final material. So we just have this overall scale to make it bigger or smaller. Then we also have the bar pieces scale, so I could just scale it down on the X, or I could also scale it down on the Y. Then we also have the gradient, so I could drag the gradient up and down. And then we also have this base color, so if I want to make this like a lighter chocolate, I could turn this up. And then also if I drag this out to make it bigger, we also have the subsurface color as well. Then we also have the amount of subsurface. We also have the roughness, and we also have the bump strength and the displacement strength if we want to bring those out and make it bigger. And then we also have the bar pieces location, so I can just drag this around if I want to change the location of those bar pieces. And there is the final render. So that's going to be it for this tutorial, so I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you for watching. And if you'd like to help support my channel, you can purchase this material on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. Links are in the description. You can also purchase all of my materials with my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack. And my Ultimate Material Pack has all of my materials pre-set up in Blender's asset browser with custom thumbnails, sorted catalogs, and customizable node groups. And if you'd like to purchase packs of 10 materials, then you can also check out my Procedural Material Packs. And to learn how to create any of my materials, you can check out my Blender Procedural Material tutorial playlist here on YouTube. But I hope you enjoyed this, and thank you for watching.